Hello everyone, and welcome back to English Tales Training, where we improve English pronunciation through stories. Today's story is particularly poignant as we delve into the life of John Parker, a soldier in the Civil War. Stay tuned until the end, as this story is incredibly emotional. John Parker sat alone in his makeshift tent, the dim light of a flickering candle casting shadows on the warm paper in front of him. Outside, the camp was alive with the sounds of men preparing for battle. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of fear mixed with determination. With a heavy heart, John dipped his quill into the inkwell and began to write. His hand moved swiftly, the words flowing from his mind onto the paper as if they had a life of their own. My dearest family, as I sit down to write this letter, my heart is heavy with the knowledge that this may be the last time I ever speak to you. Tomorrow, my unit marches into battle and the outcome is uncertain. I cannot help but think of you, my dear wife Mary, and our children, who I may never see again. I want you to know that I did not make this decision lightly. When I enlisted, I believed it was my duty to defend our country and our way of life. I still believe that, but the cost has been higher than I ever imagined. I have seen things that no man should have to see and done things that weigh heavily on my soul. I want you to know that I am proud of the man I have become, and I hope that my actions have brought honor to our family. I pray that God will watch over you and protect you in my absence. Please do not mourn me if I do not return. Instead, remember me as a man who loved his family and his country with all his heart. With all my love, John. John read over the letter one last time, his eyes filling with tears. He folded it carefully and sealed it with wax, then placed it in an envelope addressed to his wife Mary. As he did, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had said his piece, and now all that was left was to face whatever tomorrow brought. With a heavy heart, John lay down on his coat and tried to sleep, but sleep was elusive, and he spent the night staring up at the canvas ceiling, his mind filled with thoughts of home and family. When dawn broke, John rose with the rest of his unit and prepared for battle. As he donned his uniform and strapped on his gear, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had made his decision, and now it was time to see it through. As he marched out onto the battlefield, John thought of his family and the letter he had written. He knew that whatever happened, he had done what he believed was right, and that was enough. The morning sun rose over the battlefield, casting a warm glow over the fields of grass that stretched out before John and his unit. The air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the tension that hung heavy in the air. As John looked out at the enemy lines in the distance, he felt a knot form in the pit of his stomach. Today would be a day like no other. The order came down from the commanding officer, and John's unit began to move out. The sound of boots crunching in the dirt mixed with the clinking of gear and the jangle of weapons. The men moved with purpose, their faces set in grim determination. As they approached the battlefield, the sounds of war grew louder. The distant rumble of cannons, the sharp crack of rifles, and the cries of the wounded and dying filled the air. John felt a surge of adrenaline as he prepared himself for what lay ahead. The battle began in earnest as John's unit came under fire from the enemy. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt and grass around them. The men dropped to the ground, seeking whatever cover they could find. John took shelter behind a fallen tree, his heart pounding in his chest. The fighting was intense, with both sides exchanging fire in a deadly dance of death. John fired his rifle, aiming for the enemy soldiers who were advancing towards them. He could see the determination in their eyes, the same determination he felt burning inside himself. As the battle raged on, John felt a sense of camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. They fought side by side, their lives depending on each other. He saw acts of heroism and sacrifice that would stay with him for the rest of his days. But as the hours passed, John began to feel the weight of the battle bearing down on him. The noise, the chaos, the fear, it was all too much to bear. He thought of his family, of Mary, and the children waiting for him at home, and he prayed for strength to see this through. As the sun began to set, the battle finally drew to a close. John's unit emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. Many of his comrades lay wounded or dead on the battlefield. Their sacrifice is a stark reminder of the price of war. As John surveyed the scene before him, a sense of sadness washed over him. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be many more battles to come, but he also knew that he had done his duty, that he had fought with honor and courage. As he sat down to write another letter to his family, John vowed to continue fighting for them, for his country, and for the future of those who would come after him. He prayed that one day the war would end and he could return home to his family to live out the rest of his days in peace. The aftermath of the battle left John and his unit weary but determined. They had emerged victorious, but at a great cost. As they regrouped and tended to the wounded, John couldn't shake the feeling of sorrow that weighed heavily on his heart. He had seen friends fall in battle, their lives snuffed out in an instant. The reality of war was harsh and unforgiving. Despite the toll it took on him, John knew that he had to press on. The war was far from over, and there were still battles to be fought. He steeled himself for what lay ahead, knowing that he had a duty to fulfill. As the days passed, John's unit received new orders. They were to march to a new front, where the fighting was rumored to be even fiercer. John felt a knot form in his stomach as he prepared to leave. He knew that the coming days would test him like never before. The march to the new front was long and arduous. The men trudged through mud and rain, their spirits dampened by the grim reality of war. John walked alongside his comrades, their faces weary but determined. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were prepared to face whatever came their way. When they finally reached the new front, John was struck by the sheer devastation of the landscape. The once beautiful countryside was now scarred by the ravages of war. Buildings lay in ruins, fields lay barren, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The fighting on the new front was fierce and relentless. The enemy seemed determined to hold their ground, launching wave after wave of attacks. John and his unit fought bravely, but the odds were stacked against them. The enemy was well armed and well prepared, and they showed no signs of relenting. As the days turned into weeks, John began to feel the toll of the constant fighting. His body ached, his mind was weary, and his spirit was tested. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his resolve. He knew that he was fighting for a cause greater than himself, and that gave him the strength to carry on. One night, as John sat by the campfire, he received a letter from home. It was from Mary, his wife, and it filled him with both joy and sorrow. She told him of the children, how they missed their father and prayed for his safe return. She told him of the hardships they faced at home, the struggles to make ends meet, and the longing for his presence. As John read the letter, tears filled his eyes. He longed to be home with his family, to leave behind the horrors of war and embrace the life he once knew. But he also knew that he had a duty to fulfill, a duty to his country and to his fellow soldiers. With a heavy heart, John tucked the letter away and prepared for another day of fighting. He knew that the conflict would only intensify, that the battles would only get harder, but he also knew that he could not falter. He had come this far, and he would see it through to the end. The days turned into weeks, and the fighting on the new front showed no signs of slowing down. John and his unit were exhausted, their bodies weary from constant battle, but despite their fatigue they pressed on, knowing that the outcome of the war depended on their efforts. One morning, as John stood watch on the front lines, a messenger arrived with news from headquarters. The enemy was planning a major offensive, and John's unit was tasked with holding the line at all costs. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. As the enemy forces gathered on the horizon, John felt a sense of dread wash over him. He knew that the coming battle would be the most difficult yet, and that the outcome would shape the course of the war. He prayed for strength and courage, knowing that he would need both in the hours to come. The battle began with a fierce artillery barrage, shaking the ground beneath John's feet. The air was filled with the deafening roar of cannons and the screams of the wounded. John took cover behind a barricade, his heart pounding in his chest. As the enemy advanced, John and his unit fought back with everything they had. The fighting was brutal and intense, with neither side willing to give an inch. John could see the determination in the eyes of his fellow soldiers, the same determination that burned within himself. Despite the odds, John's unit held their ground. Wave after wave of enemy attacks were repelled, their advance halted by the sheer determination of the defenders. John fought with all his might, his mind focused on the task at hand. He knew that the turning point of the battle was near. And then, just as it seemed that all hope was lost, a miracle occurred. Reinforcements arrived, bolstering John's unit and turning the tide of the battle. The enemy forces were overwhelmed, their ranks shattered by the sudden onslaught. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, John looked out at the battlefield. The enemy forces were in retreat, their offensive repelled. John felt a surge of pride and relief, knowing that they had achieved the impossible. But as he looked around at the devastation, John couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. The cost of victory had been high, with many brave men laying down their lives for their country. John bowed his head in silent prayer, honoring the sacrifice of his fallen comrades. As the sun set on the battlefield, John and his unit gathered around the campfire, their spirits lifted by their hard-won victory. They knew that the war was far from over, but for now they could rest easy, knowing that they had made a difference. With the enemy forces in retreat, John and his unit were given a brief respite. They took advantage of the lull in fighting to rest and regroup, knowing that the war was far from over. But their rest was short-lived, as new orders soon arrived. The enemy was regrouping and planning a counterattack, and John's unit was once again called to the front lines. The men were weary and battered, but their spirits were high. They knew that the coming battle would be the decisive moment of the war, and they were determined to see it through to the end. As the enemy forces advanced, John and his unit prepared for the fight of their lives. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging over the battlefield. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. He had come too far to give up now. The battle began with the ferocity that caught John off guard. The enemy forces were relentless, throwing everything they had at the defenders, but John and his unit were ready. They fought back with a determination that surprised even themselves, refusing to yield an inch of ground. As the battle raged on, John found himself face to face with the enemy's commander. The two men locked eyes, each knowing that the outcome of their duel would determine the fate of the battle. They charged at each other, swords clashing in a flurry of steel. Despite the enemy commander's skill, John held his own. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that the lives of his comrades depended on his victory. With a final, decisive blow, John struck down his opponent, the enemy commander falling to the ground at his feet. With their leader defeated, the enemy forces began to falter. John and his unit pressed their advantage, driving the enemy back with a renewed vigor. The tide of the battle had turned, and victory was within their grasp. As the last of the enemy forces retreated, John and his unit stood victorious on the battlefield. The cost of their victory had been high, with many brave men falling in battle, but their sacrifice had not been in vain, though had achieved the impossible, turning the tide of the war in favor of their cause. As John looked out at the battlefield, he knew that the war was far from over. There would be many more battles to come, many more challenges to overcome. But as long as he had his comrades by his side, he knew that they could face whatever lay ahead. With a sense of pride and determination, John and his unit marched off the battlefield, ready to face whatever the future held. They were soldiers, warriors, heroes, and they would never stop fighting for what they believed in. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. John and his unit stood on the battlefield, surveying the aftermath of the bloody conflict. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both of friend and foe. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. John felt a deep sense of sadness wash over him as he looked upon the faces of his fallen comrades. They had fought bravely, giving their lives for a cause they believed in. John bowed his head in silent prayer, honoring their sacrifice and mourning their loss. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, John and his unit began the grim task of burying the dead. It was a somber and heartbreaking task, but one that had to be done. Each fallen soldier was laid to rest with the dignity and respect, their sacrifice never to be forgotten. As the last of the fallen were laid to rest, John and his unit gathered around the campfire. The mood was solemn, the weight of their loss hanging heavy in the air. But amidst the sadness, there was also a sense of camaraderie and unity. They had faced death together and had emerged stronger because of it. As they sat around the campfire, sharing stories and memories of their fallen comrades, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the war was far from over, but for now, they could take solace in the fact that they had done their duty. They had fought with honor and courage, and they had emerged victorious. As the night wore on, John and his unit talked late into the night, finding comfort in each other's company. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he lay down to sleep that night, John felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for his comrades, for their bravery and sacrifice, gratitude for the opportunity to serve his country and fight for a cause he believed in. And above all, gratitude for the chance to make a difference in the world, no matter how small. As he drifted off to sleep, John knew that the war was far from over, but he also knew that as long as he had his comrades by his side, he could face whatever challenges lay ahead, and that gave him hope for the future. After months of fighting, John and his unit finally received orders to return home. The war was over, and they were hailed as heroes for their bravery and sacrifice. As they marched back to their hometown, John felt a mix of emotions. He was relieved that the fighting was over, but also saddened by the memories of the friends he had lost along the way. As they approached the town, John could see the familiar sights that he had missed so much. The church steeple rising above the trees, the town square bustling with activity, and the warm glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. It was good to be home. As they entered the town, John and his unit were greeted with cheers and applause. The townspeople lined the streets, waving flags and banners, eager to welcome their heroes home. John felt a swell of pride in his chest as he marched through the town, his head held high. When they reached the town square, a celebration was in full swing. There was food and drink aplenty, and music filled the air. John and his comrades were treated as guests of honor, their every need attended to. It was a joyous occasion, a stark contrast to the horrors of war they had endured. As the celebration continued into the night, John found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the friends he had lost, the battles he had fought, and the sacrifices he had made. But he also thought of the bonds of brotherhood that had been forged in the fires of war, bonds that would last a lifetime. As the night wore on, John found himself surrounded by friends and family, all eager to hear his stories of the war. He regaled them with tales of bravery and sacrifice, of battles won and lost, But amidst the celebration, there was also a sense of sadness, a realization that the scars of war would never fully heal. As the sun began to rise, signaling the end of the celebration, John stood in the town square, surrounded by his comrades and loved ones. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges and hardships to overcome, but he also knew that as long as he had the support of his friends and family, he could face whatever lay ahead. With a sense of peace in his heart, John looked out at the town that he had fought so hard to protect. It was a town that had been through so much, but it was also a town filled with hope and resilience. And as he watched the sun rise over the horizon, John knew that no matter what the future held, he would always be proud to call this town his home. After the celebrations had died down, life in the town began to return to normal. John and his comrades settled back into civilian life, grateful for the peace and quiet after months of fighting. But despite the return to normalcy, there was a sense of restlessness among the veterans. They had faced death together, forged bonds that could never be broken, and now they longed for the camaraderie of the battlefield. One day, as John was walking through town, he ran into an old comrade from the war, Jack. The two men embraced, their faces breaking into wide smiles. It had been months since they had last seen each other, and they had much to catch up on. Over a cup of coffee at a local diner, John and Jack reminisced about their time in the war. They shared stories of the battles they had fought, the friends they had lost, and the moments of camaraderie that had sustained them through the darkest times. As they talked, John felt a sense of gratitude for the bond he shared with his fellow soldiers. They were more than friends, they were family. As the days turned into weeks, John and Jack began to organize reunions for their fellow veterans. They reached out to old friends, tracked down comrades who had moved away, and soon a group of veterans was meeting regularly to share stories and memories. The reunions became a highlight of John's week, a chance to reconnect with the past and with the friends who had become like brothers to him. One evening, as John and his comrades sat around the campfire sharing stories and laughter, a sense of peace settled over him. Despite the hardships they had faced, despite the loss and the pain, they had survived. They had come through the fire together, and they were stronger because of it. As the night wore on, John looked around at his comrades, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. He knew that the bonds they shared were unbreakable, that they would always be there for each other, no matter what the future held. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, the sound of laughter and camaraderie echoing in his ears, John felt a sense of contentment that he had not felt in a long time. He knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, as long as he had his comrades by his side, he could face anything. As time passed, John and his fellow veterans continued to meet regularly, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They shared stories of their time in the war, of the friends they had lost, and of the battles they had fought. But amidst the laughter and the camaraderie, there was also a sense of solemnity, a realization that their time together was fleeting. One day, as they sat around the campfire, John proposed an idea. He suggested that they create a memorial to honor their fallen comrades, a place where their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The idea was met with enthusiastic approval, and the veterans set to work planning the memorial. They decided to build the memorial in the town square, where it would serve as a reminder of the cost of war to future generations. They raised funds, enlisted the help of local craftsmen, and soon the memorial began to take shape. It was a simple yet poignant tribute, a place where the names of the fallen would be forever etched in stone. As the memorial was unveiled, a sense of pride and sadness washed over John. Pride in what they had accomplished, in the lasting legacy they had created, but also sadness for the friends they had lost, for the lives cut short by the brutality of war. He knew that no memorial could ever truly capture the sacrifice of those brave men, but he hoped that it would serve as a reminder to future generations of the cost of our freedom. As the years passed, the memorial became a focal point of the town, a place of reflection and remembrance. John and his fellow veterans visited often, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, but their bond remained strong, their memories of the war as vivid as ever. As they sat and talked, reminiscing about their time in the war, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that his time was short, but he was grateful for the life he had lived, for the friends he had made, and for the memories he had created. As the days turned into weeks, John's health continued to decline. He grew weaker with each passing day, his body unable to fight off the ravages of age and illness, but through it all, he remained stoic, refusing to let his pain show. One evening, as John lay in his bed, surrounded by his loved ones, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that his time had come, but he was not afraid. He had lived a full life filled with love and laughter, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As he closed his eyes for the final time, John thought back on his life, on the battles he had fought, and the friends he had lost. But above all, he thought of the legacy he would leave behind, of the memorial in the town square that bore the names of the fallen. He knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that he had helped to ensure that their memory would live on, and as John took his final breath, surrounded by those he loved, he did so with a heart full of gratitude. Gratitude for the life he had lived, for the friends he had made, and for the chance to make a difference in the world. And as he slipped away into the darkness, he did so knowing that he had lived a life worth living, a life filled with purpose and meaning. If you enjoyed today's story and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought. Your interaction is very important to us and helps us to keep bringing you amazing stories. Thank you for watching and see you in the next